This is our home and you'll never take it! Stand back or be burned!
Now today, we are taking a trip back in time to the summer of 1887 to look at what I can only describe as a truly dramatic historical showdown. We're going to be talking about the O'Halloran family. They were a group of Irish tenant farmers who literally transformed their own home into an impenetrable fortress. Why? To stand their ground against a heavily armed eviction force. It's an incredible story, so let's just dive right into the history. So to really grasp the stakes here, we have to put ourselves right behind the barricaded walls of the O'Halloran home in June of 1887. Frank O'Halloran, who was one of the sons defending the property, later put it perfectly. He said, "When the time for eviction came, we were firmly resolved to defend the house with our lives." Think about that for a second. This wasn't some dry legal dispute over property rights, This was a desperate life-or-death struggle. The family was completely backed into a corner, and they were absolutely willing to pay the ultimate price to protect this home that they had built with their very own hands. Part 1. The Siege of Bodycheck. Okay, paint this picture in your mind. It's 10:30 in the morning. And this wasn't just, say, a couple of local deputies knocking on the door. No. This was a massive, formidable force marching right over the hill toward the house. We are talking about armed police, regimented soldiers, bailiffs, and a highly specialized eviction crew that was notoriously known as the Crowbar Brigade. Now, Frank O'Halloran made a really profound observation as he was looking out at this army. He looked at the armed police, many of whom were actually Irishmen themselves, and he noted this incredibly dark irony. He realized that the sons of the people were being turned into the greatest enemies the people had. Part 2. The Irish Land War. Now, a confrontation like this, it doesn't just happen overnight, right? It was actually the boiling point of years of intense systemic pressure. If we look back to 1879, a really terrible economy led these desperate tenants to beg for rent reductions. But absentee landlords completely flat out denied them. So by 1880, peaceful organizing had grown massive. 10,000 people showed up to a land league demonstration in nearby Scariff, and they had heavy support from the local clergy. But then things turned incredibly tragic in 1881. A man named John Maloney was killed during a clash with police who were serving eviction writs. So you have years of these ignored pleas, years of tragic skirmishes, and it essentially built a powder keg. And that powder keg finally exploded into the brutal body K evictions of June 1887. To really understand the friction here, you have to compare the two sides. Take the O'Hallorans. They had been tenants on this land for generations. They literally built their two-story slated house entirely with their own labor, pouring about 220 pounds into its construction. And let me tell you, that was a small fortune at the time. Then, look at the other side. You have Colonel John O'Callaghan. He was an absentee landlord owning over 4,800 acres of land. And despite the intense economic hardships his tenants were facing, he just stubbornly refused to grant any of the necessary rent reductions, and he fiercely opposed their attempts to organize. And this wildly uneven power dynamic played out financially too. According to historical records, back in the O'Halloran's grandfather's time, the rent was around 13 pounds. But get this, because the family worked tirelessly to improve their own land and build a much better house for themselves, they were actually punished for it financially. The landlord hiked their rent all the way up to 31 pounds. Now, eventually, a court did reduce it slightly, but that underlying tension was completely baked in. They were being financially squeezed for the exact reason that they were hardworking and industrious. Part 3. Preparing for the attack. So, knowing what was coming, the O'Hallorans' defensive strategy was just incredibly methodical. First, they blocked up all the doors and windows with these massive, formidable tree logs. Second, they somehow anticipated the exact corner where the eviction party would try to break through the wall, so they heaped huge quantities of earth, stones, and turf right inside that specific corner. Third, and this is wild, they actually deconstructed their own home, removing the upper floorboards so they could launch counterattacks from above. And finally, they boiled copious amounts of water and meal. These were ordinary people meticulously planning tactical defense against an armed battalion. Part 4. The Crowbar Brigade strikes. So as this infamous Crowbar Brigade approaches the walls with their picks and axes, the family is ready. And it was actually the women of the house who struck the first defensive blow. Sisters Annie, Honoria, and Sarah stood their ground at these makeshift portholes they'd carved out. And the very second the attackers got close enough, the sisters just rained down cans of boiling water and scalding liquid onto them. The emergency men were absolutely battered and burned, and they were forced into a very speedy retreat. Now, while the sisters were holding the walls, Frank was having to adapt on the fly. Turns out Frank was left-handed, which meant he actually couldn't get a good angle with his defensive pole at his designated porthole, so he improvises. He later noted, "I got an iron bar and broke a hole through the roof, a shower of slates falling on the emergency men outside." So between the boiling water raining down from the sisters and the heavy slates falling from Frank, that initial ground assault on the corner of the house was completely thwarted. Part 5. Bayonets and bare fists. Okay, so realizing they just couldn't break through the ground floor, the eviction party changes their tactics. The armed police bring out these large scaling ladders to try and breach a second-story window. And as the first policeman gets through the window, who does he meet? Honoria O'Halloran. And in this incredibly cinematic moment, Honoria barehandedly grabs the blade of his sword bayonet. She held on so tight, literally risking severing her own fingers, just to maintain control of the weapon as the policeman tried to jerk it away. Seeing his sister in such intense danger, Frank leaps right into the action. He recalled it like this: "I jumped off the platform and struck him with my clenched fist under the chin and sent him sprawling. It's pure chaos." Honoria then grabs the dropped rifle to scatter the officers trying to climb up the ladder outside, while Frank uses a long pole to literally shove another invading officer backward. And outside, a crowd of thousands who were watching this whole thing unfold erupted into deafening cheers as the window was cleared. But inside that room, the tension was at an absolute peak. The brothers had dragged the sprawling policeman back to the window, and they fully intended to just throw him out onto the hard ground below. But at the absolute last possible second, a local priest named Father Hannon appears at the top of the ladder outside, shouting, "Don't throw him out, Frank." See, the priest knew that if an officer was tossed from the second story, the heavily armed police waiting below would instantly open fire on the house, and it would end in an absolute massacre. So respecting the priest's warning, Frank let the officer go. A chaotic hand-to-hand brawl still ensued inside, but eventually the family was subdued by the sheer numbers of the force. Part 6. Victory Hard Won. Following the breach, there were obviously immediate consequences. Frank and his mother were arrested right there on the spot and sent to Limerick jail, while the sisters were released, though they were pending prosecution. But here's the amazing part. The eviction itself ended up being largely symbolic, because that very same night, the local community came together and forcibly reoccupied the house. They rebuilt the smashed walls, they relit the fires, and they moved right back in. The government's physical victory had literally lasted mere hours. So, what is the larger takeaway here? Well, the Bodiac evictions were heavily attended by radical reporters like Henry Norman, and that meant the O'Hallorans' incredible stand received widespread international press coverage. This created an absolute PR nightmare and a deep embarrassment for the British Conservative government of the time. The sheer stubbornness of these tenants, who simply kept reoccupying their homes night after night, proved to the world that brute force couldn't break their resolve. And ultimately, this fiercely localized defiance helped pave the way for lasting, systemic change. Because by 1909, the laws had fundamentally shifted, and the tenants were finally given the right to purchase and own their own land. As we wrap up this explainer, the story leaves us with a pretty heavy, lingering question to think about. When the law protects the oppressor, is defiance the only path to justice? The O'Halloran family was facing an entirely legal but deeply imbalanced system. Their choice to barricade their doors, boil that water, and fight back with everything they had wasn't just about saving a structure made of stone and sleet. It was about demanding basic human dignity. It really is a timeless legacy of civil resistance that absolutely still resonates today. Thank you so much for joining me as we explored these fascinating historical records. I hope this deep dive leaves you curious to go out and learn even more about the hidden battles of history. See you next time.